Hey, everybody. Good day. This is Tosca at NGO Soul and Strategy. And I am excited. I have back in the room with me Monica Maassen of Oxfam International. And I'm going to interview Monica this time about virtual team leadership. And we'll explain to you in a moment why that is. So, Monica, welcome.
Thank you, Tosca. Well, I'm really excited also to have this conversation because it's also a way to reflect again. And yeah.
And I know you love that.
I love that. Yeah, yeah, that's correct.
And you're very good in it. So let me explain a little bit why I invited Monica back to the show. So first of all, Monica is the head of Oxfam International's Change Management and Learning. She used to be the head of organizational effectiveness in Oxfam, was at one point also the deputy director for change management, and also the head of change management of Oxfam Novib, that is the Dutch affiliate of Oxfam. So as you can see, Monica is rock solid when it comes to change management, and she's also very keen to always be reflective in her praxis. And we are interviewing Monica today in the context of the fact that our small team of freelance collaborators at Five Oaks Consulting has launched a new online course on virtual team leadership and the skills that are needed for that. And we call that course Post-Pandemic Virtual Team Leadership Essentials. And the first cohort that just took that course, that included Monica. And I wanted to explore with one of the participants some of the key findings and experiences that participants highlighted in the course. And Monica, as I said, you came to mind immediately because you have that rock solid background in change management, while you also were a very thoughtful participant. So I'm excited to learn from you. So Monica, for people to kind of get to know you a little bit more, tell us first in general, how did you come to managing and leading teams in general? And how did you come to managing hybrid and virtual teams? Something tells me well before the pandemic.
Yeah, that is correct. Thank you, Tosca. Yeah, like you already said, I have a long history in Oxfam. So that, there was first a change in when I was still working for Oxfam Novib from not a management position into a management position. I then became regional director for Southern Africa in a long time ago, and then had several management and directors functions, and then moved into the change management, much more change leadership. And also I first did that in Oxfam Novib, leading and supporting quite strategic change in Oxfam Novib because of the change of the funding of the Dutch government. And then after a number of years, I moved to Oxfam International. And I think that is the moment, and I think that's already 7 or 8 years ago, that I moved a bit to virtual team work. Because at that time, I became part of what is called the Oxfam International Secretariat that had some people in Oxford, but also had, for instance, a colleague in Australia and people in different other locations. So I think from that moment on, I started working partially virtual. But then, there was always in combination also the presence. So in the beginning, I went once a month, to Oxford for a week, and then went back to the Netherlands where I'm based. And that gradually changed. But then there were always still, the team meetings, either in Barcelona or in Nairobi, where from time to time you would meet your Oxfam International colleagues. And then in between, you would continue working on virtual.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So you have a total of at least about 8 years of experience with managing and leading both hybrid and virtual teams. And as we said before, you're a specialist in change management. And that is why I wanted to also get a hold of you for this podcast interview. And listeners, if you're interested to learn from Monica's long experience in change management, then please, I refer you back to our podcast episode 1, which you can find on our website. So obviously, unlike you, a number of us have gotten a crash course in the practice of virtual, often initially virtually, and now gradually perhaps hybrid forms of teams. Kind of conceptually, how do you see the nexus, the link between change management and virtual or hybrid team leadership, both from an individual leader's perspective and from an organizational perspective? I'd just be interested in a few general thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting question. And I think the core of my answer will probably be around how you look at leadership. Because if you, and I think that was also part of your of the course. Sort of if you look at sort of leadership in these times, there is a lot of unexpected and change in that. And I think, in the past, sometimes you had to explain that, but I think now with COVID, I think we've all learned that, you can have everything planned and etc. But in reality, you have to adapt. And I think that always has been the case, but only the level of change and where that change is taking place is different. Because now, the North is really impacted by that sudden change. But I think many of our colleagues in countries like Ethiopia, DRC, Mali, sort of are dealing with that on a permanent basis. That change of context, change of situation. And I think as leaders, we need to be ready for that. And what I found interesting in the course, Tosca, that you led together with your colleague Ahmed, is that sort of somewhere in the documentation they are talking of what is, I think, something like what was it called? The fallacy of
the fallacy of planning.
The fallacy of planning. And for me, I think that is one of the, I really like that article because I think, and especially in a sector like where we are working as Oxfam and international cooperation, there's so much, not expected and planned and change of context. So also we need to plan and change as organization. So there are limitations to how much you can plan. And I'm not saying don't plan. Oh, of course you have to plan, but it's sort of so there's for me is the nexus between the two. So I think every leader needs some understanding and experience and vision on change and change management. And
interesting. Interesting. And I'm just going to interrupt myself for a moment. I realized that I forgot to mention something important, and this is for full transparency. So while the course is obviously a product for which NGO leaders and managers have to pay, because this was the inaugural course, we decided to invite a number of podcast guests of the show who have appeared earlier to kind of trial run the course for free. And Monica is one of those participants. So I want to be transparent about that. So let's dive into some, not all, of the course topics that we covered. So there's a total of 6 or so big themes in the course, and the last 3 are on resilience, conflict management in a virtual team context. And we wanted to offer a little taster of what, since these are leaders and managers who take the course, how do they see strategically the employee experience in INGOs and NGOs in the longer term. So on that, Monica, I wanted to ask you each time, tell us what did you, what in from your perspective is a big pain point, a difficult challenge, and what is one of the key lessons you took from the course or from your own pre-existing knowledge? So let's start with resilience. What, in your experience, is a pain point when it comes to virtual or hybrid team leadership, with a focus on leadership and team leadership, and your personal resilience and the team's resilience?
Yeah, well, what is a pain point? Well, I will try to zoom in a bit specific on the virtual context, because that is part of the because there's always an issue about resilience, etc. And,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
two are interlinked. But let me zoom in a bit more on resilience in virtual teams. Well, I think sort of when we're working in virtual teams, you see some general pain points, pitfalls, and one of them, and I think that is one that is in Oxfam and in INGOs in general, I think one of the pitfalls is that we're very focused on conversation. We're very focused on action, and sort of the attention for relationships, the human, the question, is a challenge in general. That was already pre-pandemic, etc. But if you're totally, all the work, the collaboration is happening virtual, there's a risk of focusing so much on that content. So you go from, if I look sometimes at my calendar, it's 4 or 5 calls behind each other.
Yeah.
And you go from one to one, and you enter, and you go
do your business.
Do your business, and you move on. So I think you need to be real intentional about the listening, asking questions about people's background, the living situation, where they are, how COVID is impacting in a specific country, etc. Because what you don't ask, you also don't see. And that is the big difference between working in a virtual team and in reality. In a non-virtual world, you see people, you see where they are, you see them in their office, you see them in their, sometimes in the country they are living when you visit them. But now you don't see all of that. So I think that's really important. And so you really need purposefully to invest in relationships, in the well-being and feeling, push back on the action-oriented content, etc.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant! And I loved your quote: "When you don't ask, or what you don't ask about, you will not see." I love it. Yeah, and that's what we talk about in the course, isn't it? About this task orientation versus relationship orientation, and that counterintuitively, we need more focus on relationship than in face-to-face in co-located context. But the fact that we interact through our devices means that we become even actually more task-oriented, which is problematic. So let's turn to conflict management. What in the virtual space? Not an easy thing. What in your experience is one of the pain points, and what is one thing you took away from the course?
Yeah, well, I think conflict, I think in general, I think also in INGOs, we like debate and etc. But the real conflicts, sometimes we avoid. But I think if you want to really, avoid a conflict, because that, or you really want to make it a productive conflict, that it's co-creating something new, and sometimes conflict, that can lead to something Absolutely. New inside. So I'm not at all against conflict, but it needs to lead to something. I think it's much more challenging in a virtual context, because you miss the body language, you miss, and you're also the spontaneous moment where, where you feel you have a conflict with someone. You walk into the office at the moment, a Friday late afternoon where there's, and you walk in and you start reflecting on the conflict, etc. I think that's much more difficult in a virtual world.
Yeah.
So it means you really need to look for the right moment. You need to create it very purposefully, quite often. And then I think one of the biggest problems I have is not the direct conflict, because once there is a direct conflict, you're more inclined to do something. But what you see often is, the conflict. The conflict is not outspoken.
Mm-hmm.
But people you work with just, they don't respond or they don't participate in the call anymore. They walk out because they say, they have to go to another meeting, or, it's that avoidance where I think, which is the most challenging, where you can't read whether that is a conflict or tensions or whatever, or not. So it means you need to much more to cross-check, are you, is there a problem? Are you angry with me, or etc.? But I also noticed the other way around, that I also sometimes I think, okay, I'm really irritated, but I do the same, so that's also, so how do you do that? And and then interpersonal conflict solving is much more difficult, because all the, there's some great tools and techniques, like deep democracy, active listening, etc. But what you see with these is that they often require silence, for instance, as a very powerful thing. Just wait and listen, and to do that in a online call, is much more difficult, and so it is more challenging. And I think so, to solve them, I think, and that's also what I think you introduced in the course, you need to be quite explicit in the different steps. So first acknowledging there are tensions, and then to really ask first, then listen, and then to summarize what you're hearing, and then checking whether what you've heard is the right summary, and then going into the next step, etc. So so, and that is with everything in the virtual world. Although you think it's very easy, you can just run in a call, and I think you can do it, but you need to really prepare well, think through in advance how you do it, and etc. So
yeah. And then finally, the last element in the course is kind of a little bit of a strategic look forward towards the new employee experience. What are the future-oriented strategies that NGOs and NGOs need to employ to get ready for the post-pandemic employee experience, which will consist of a lot more hybrid and virtual, to the extent it didn't already happen, but might have other elements as well. What is one question you have about the future of the employee experience in Oxfam post-pandemic, more broadly?
Well, first of all, I'm living in the Netherlands, and many of us thought we were almost post-pandemic, but the figures are going up again. So the concept of post-pandemic for me at itself is something to reflect upon. What
it's problematic.
It's maybe problematic, yeah. But yeah, let's assume the situation will improve or normalize, or we get used to this new context. I think that in Oxfam we will not go back to the same level of traveling, and not only because of COVID, but also because of our climate footprint, and also because of a wider discussion about decolonization of aid, where I think rightfully it is challenged whether, all these so-called capacity building trips are really needed and adding value, and whether we shouldn't have more power and resources and decision making in the countries. So that is challenging, the traveling and etc.
Yeah.
So I think virtual teams and virtual collaboration will be a more permanent, and I hope it will be a more permanent reality. But then, of course, the question is, how do you do that well? And how do you make sure that people feel part of a team, and if they're not together, how do we make sure that everyone has enough skills to do that properly? So we have some really great examples where, for instance, next week there's in Oxfam is hosting what is called an institutional funding meeting, and that is one of the examples where I think the virtual reality of that meeting is much more interesting and better than the old ones, which were face to face. Because now it is because if you look at the participants, it is much more inclusive than before, because many of the staff in countries were short of budget to travel for these kind of trips, or it was for other reasons difficult. And now it is not only affiliate country teams, regional teams, but it's also we're inviting partners to this conference. And so you see now that, so there's a much broader level of participation, and that is possible also because it is virtual.
Of course.
But of course, then it also means that the preparation, it started a half year ago to really organize it as well. This is not because it's virtual, you just do it. Maybe it's even more complex.
And the inclusivity of that creates other design and facilitation issues. They are both advantages, but they're new challenges that needs to be overcome in how it is led and how it's designed and how people prepare.
And language is one of them. That's always in, of course, sort of the power and dominance of English as a sort of common language. I think is an issue. But there, I think technology is moving fast. So I assume that. So now already with Google Translate or whatever program, you can easily translate a chat or whatever during, but that will get better and better. So and that's also, I think, if I think about the future, that's the opportunity side. But the other challenge is indeed sort of how do I feel part of a team? If I don't see them face to face, etc. And especially, I think when all goes well, when we're all in the celebrating mode, it's easier than when there's challenges, and that can be at organizational level, but also at personal level. I was sick last year for a few months, and then you realize that being in a virtual team, is different when you're sick, because no one is coming just to see me, because the team is online. So it's and of course there are ways to deal with that, but there's these very concrete things that
very concrete. I loved that aspect. I'd never thought about that, but that is absolutely true. Now, Monica, you brought up a topic to the course and said, I would like us to discuss this and I would like some content on it. And that is inter-team virtual collaboration. Now, the course is primarily focused on intra-team leadership, but very legitimately you said, well, how about inter-team collaboration in the virtual teams? Why did you bring that up in the course, and what did you learn about it?
Yeah, well, for me, to be honest, that is the biggest challenge, the intra-team virtual collaboration.
Sorry, I need to interrupt. Did you say intra or inter?
Inter, sorry, yeah, I was mixing. Sorry,
right.
I meant inter and I said intra, sorry. Because I think sort of with your own team, it is quite not easy, but I think, they're easier ways, to plan regular calls as a team. You can agree on how you communicate. Hey, you can have regular catch up with team members. That's all a clear. It is a more a matter of organizing. But I think if you're all in one office or you see each other regular, you have these many connections with people that are not your primary team. But because you're in office, you just, you drink a coffee together, you go for lunch. It's all this informal that sort of and often that is so important because it brings in that other perspective, that new insight. We think this, but in operations they think this, or so
if I can just stop you for a moment, what I hear you say is you're missing these either impromptu, spontaneous, sometimes planned, but in the short term or in the short notice, these where you bump into each other as teams and you hear about the perspective of another that you do need to take into account. That's exactly harder in the virtual context.
Yeah, much harder. Yeah. And it's also in sort of, so we have a travel policy now, which is, no travel except for, really, I don't know what the exact wording is, but critical trips. But if they are quite often, with your core team, or, it is not this, well, let's now, if we are in programs, let's work, you have a session with the influencing team. Because it's not seen as sort of the business critical trip that, if we don't do it.
I got it.
Yeah. So, and that's a pity. And a risk also of disconnect. And that is, so if you take, and so some of it is good, but some there's a real risk. So like coming back to the travel, and sort of in organizations like Oxfam, there's people from affiliates visiting country programs, there's staff from regional platforms visiting country programs, but also the other way around. And I think, although we should challenge some of these trips, whether they are really adding value, and are not part of a decolonial setup or whatever. What they in general also contribute to is a sense of common. We share something, common purpose. We are in this together. Appreciation for each other. Really, you feel part of a wider, a bigger part, the bigger Oxfam family or confederation, whatever you call it. But if you're in one place, you don't travel a lot, you're dependent on virtual connections, a greater effort and new tools are needed to ensure that connectivity remains. So one of the things we are experimenting with or piloting is sort of virtual country visits, sort of where a team is sharing, but sort of, and I think so. There are possibilities. It's all possible, but it
needs to be intentionally recreated and designed for.
And also making time for it,
and making time for it, because we're already very, very busy, and that task orientation may well prevent us from doing that again.
And it's the category important but not urgent.
Exactly. Well said. Important but not urgent. But harmful in the long term. So across the course, Monica, what to you, if I can just ask you and just highlight one or two things that were for you the biggest eye openers, or maybe a counterintuitive thing that you wouldn't have thought makes sense, or that initially you would have never figured out, but that you took away from the course? Can you just pick one or two?
Yeah, well, at first what comes to my mind, because it's also about fun, and what you enjoy and what surprises you, or sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And what I liked about the course anyhow was that there, in the you had the reading material, but you also had podcasts, and there's so many podcasts nowadays that it's really helpful if someone has a look and select some, and the one that I enjoyed very much was one from Brené Brown. And what was the other?
And I think her name is
Priya
Parker, right?
Yeah, Parker. Yeah, and the podcast was called Meeting Makeover. And it was so funny. But I think it really thought, this, but also so courageous, because Brené Brown invited Priya Parker to, as a sort of external person, to have a look at their team meeting, and then ask questions, challenge how it is organized and running, and say how she would sort of suggest to do it different. And I thought that is, often we're so used to, this is how we do the meetings, this is how we do, and it is grown organically for good reasons. It was probably good in the past. That was,
it served you in the past.
It served you in the past, but it's not necessarily, the best for the future.
Yeah.
And that funny form of, but also being courageous, asking someone from outside. Just join and listen and ask critical questions. And that one I enjoyed very much.
That's fun to hear. And just for our listeners, Priya Parker is well known as a facilitation expert. She has written books about I think it's called The Art of Gathering, if I'm recollecting correctly. Interesting. Yeah, I know you highlighted it in the course. So I think you've already, in so many ways, told me what is some of the things you miss from working in co-located context. And I know you still have a co-located context with your colleagues in Oxfam Novib, but still. But what is one of the biggest things you do not miss from being in co-located teams all the time?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question, Tosca, because that's also what I said during the course a few times. It's sometimes in this discussion about virtual teams, it is all about the negativity, etc. And it also has a lot of advantages. Very, very basic, 1.5 to 2 hours travel time that I'm saving if I but also there's the spontaneous, nice exchange, but there's also the ineffectivity of being in a room with 3 colleagues where 3 at the same calling into a call, and you're irritated because there's too much noise in the room, or you can't focus, etc. So and I think so that is that's what is nice, and it is nice to sort of but that also depends on one's situation at home. But for me, what I really love is, you can mix a few things. I for instance, my cooking for the evening, I sometimes, I start preparing, during lunch already, or a bit, and then I do a bit because I need a tea break, and I, in the meantime, do the cutting of the vegetables, and and that is with many things. You just merge it a bit, and organically, and
now, of course, as you said, that depends on your home context, right? If you have a family running around in the home, it's incredibly difficult to focus, right? And there is the connectivity issue, if that hasn't been addressed. There is the noise pollution coming in from outside, etc., that we need to. So there's a lot of also equity aspects to this.
There's so much,
that we cannot do justice to in this particular conversation, but that are very interesting. And one of the things that I'm also interested in is, parenthetically, is the kind of connection between diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and virtual teams. Where do virtual teams actually reinforce an organization's commitment to DEI and belonging, and where does those concerns get harmed? So maybe let's talk lastly a little bit about power in teams, and what shifts potentially, if anything, in hybrid or virtual teams. How does power show up? You've referenced it a little bit in terms of the inclusiveness of meeting. Is there something else you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, I think this is for me one of the sort of still a topic where we need to pay more attention to really understand how power works in a virtual context, and what are the key factors in that. They might be different in whether you're in a virtual team or not. And I think in INGOs, we anyhow have already many power issues.
Of course.
So the north, the south, the language, the time zones is then, of course, a critical one. But also the cultural, sort of the sort of cultural identity of where someone is coming from. And I think what you see with virtual is that some people find it much more easy in a call with many people to take the space, and provide some input verbally, where others need much more, are more for cultural reasons or for personal, the more introvert or extrovert people, that is much more might be more challenging for some in a virtual meeting. Although I have also heard people say that I'm more introvert, saying that they prefer the virtual because it's not all being sitting in one room and etc. But I think it's unpacking all of that. But I have seen colleagues calling in from from very difficult home situations where children were running around, etc. And so they couldn't focus well. And or the connection is still very weak or problematic.
So that their point cannot come across.
Yeah, exactly. So they can't share their video because that is taking too much bandwidth. And we shouldn't underestimate what the risk is of the fact that people are not contributing on an equal way. So
footing.
Yeah, or equal footing. Yeah, exactly. That's and we need to remain very sharp on that, I think.
That's it. So that is definitely an area that we both need to reflect on and also document, and especially ways of overcoming. And of course, facilitation ways can overcome this partially. But there is I totally agree with you. It's one of the lesser walked roads that in the virtual space that we need to do more work on. Well, Monica, we have to bring this to a close. It's been fascinating as always. And I just want to emphasize, you really were a wonderful participant in our course, and I learned a lot from you. So if other people like me are very curious about you, where should they go to learn more about you?
Well, I think it's the quite usual space, LinkedIn, but also Twitter. I'm not an active. I'm not active in the sense that I write a lot of tweets myself, but I do share. That might be interesting. And and I want to thank you, Tosca, also for the course, because sort of, I think many people will recognize that we're all often so busy in, with our work. So taking, I think the course, besides the content, what it really offers is a pause moment to reflect, to be pushed to read a bit because we're often, also so busy. So and I think I really believe in the statement that what you give attention will grow. So by giving attention through a course, I'm convinced
that your practice will grow and
exactly.
your attention to what happens in the virtual space is
Yeah.
going. What you give attention to will grow. I like that sentence as well. Well, thank you so much, Monica, for that kind compliment, and thank you for all the insights you gave both in the course and in this podcast. And thank you, listeners, for checking in on us. If you found this podcast stimulating, listeners, be sure to check out other episodes on the podcast that you can find on my website, fiveoaksconsulting.org. And if you're interested to find out more about the course itself, we have a separate website for that. That is fiveoaks.teachable.com. Be sure to future-proof your career by investing in these essential skills and also to help you stand out from the crowd. And your team, will thank you. So this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you next time on NGO, Soul, and Strategy.